People often ask why the Climate Majority Project doesn't have a simpler theory of change. And yeah, I'd like to take a moment to answer that. First of all, I think it's useful to keep in mind a famous H.L. Mencken quote, which says, for every difficult and complicated question, there's an answer that's simple, clear, and wrong. That's something to keep in mind when thinking about a theory of change, because we're talking about something fiendishly difficult, right? There is a sense in which the demand for a simple, clear theory of change has in it a sort of climate denial, right? Where we like ourselves to be in a situation to which there's a simple, clear question, right? And I don't mean to be, derogatory in any way to people who ask that question. It's a perfectly natural one. But we can think of in fiction, right? There's things like simple, clear, fictional narratives like Luke Skywalker going down the trench of the Death Star with his X-Wing and delivering a photon torpedo straight into the main generator, right? Which then finishes thing, or the celebrated stand of the 300 at the pass of Thermopylae, right, where we have this simple, clear thing: the Persians need to pass Thermopylae. We're going to take our 300 best soldiers, and we're going to starve this invading army at the pass of Thermopylae, right? It makes for great fiction if a few people can follow a easy path to victory, right? But the reality of movements over time that succeeded and took on anything like what we're talking about doing in the climate movement, which is getting quite a lot of people, at least CMP's theory of change, because we think we need a democratic movement to force movement on the issues of our time. COP isn't going to do it. None of the governments are going to do it. Only a group of people across society, across political persuasions, banding together, recognizing their common interest as members of a failing system, of an economic system that's failing, with a shared interest, much like our ancestors had a shared interest. If there's a few people who owned all the property and weren't really paying anybody what they were worth, and it took a lot of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, turn around, go in another direction, and then continue again type of organizing, to finally get to the point where at some point when we were going for 40-hour work weeks and delivering the coup de grace at the ends of the major labor mobilizations that won the greatest victory, there might have been something like a 4-point plan. We're not quite there yet in the climate movement. Is the easy answer, right, to that question for an easy theory of change. So if we did have one, you should probably mistrust us. So all that said, we do have a plan that is maybe as simple as possible for moving to the next stage of climate action in Britain. And of course, this is something up for discussion. It's meant to drop in a wide variety of people, like I mentioned before, into a collective process of discussion. But I can lay out some guiding principles and then steps to something like a can bill. Okay, first of all, where are we in the climate movement? Basically, the government's not doing its job. There is no climate mobilization. Because of that, we have this worldwide problem, which is unaddressed. And because of that, when we even think about it, when a person who isn't already engaged in climate action starts thinking about it, it's typical for them to just become overwhelmed. And climate communicators, knowing that, try not to overwhelm them by not really talking about how serious things are. Precisely how far along we are in warming, precisely how much chaos there is in the system, precisely what type of political and economic interests are against coming together, precisely how disorganized we are, right? So what one needs to do is to create the type of climate movement that gives people the sense of being able to take personally meaningful action as part of something large enough to make a difference that can actually, in the end, result in what we need. So how can we do that? The 4 dimensions of climate action. So you have to know what you're up against. You have to have the ability to take personal, meaningful action. You have to feel like that's part of a larger movement that's big enough to make a difference. And especially at these beginning stages when anybody who starts thinking about it, even remotely seriously, gets intimidated and has emotional difficulties with the thought of being part of the first stages, some kind of hopelessly outgunned group of people that want to do something about this, then you need collective support, emotional support. So again, knowing the problem, you can hold truthfulness, personal, meaningful action, feeling part of something larger, and collective support. So if you can create those environments for people, then you can unlock this kind of motivation for climate action. Right now what's happening is we're not really talking about how bad it is. So name me a mobilization that has ever happened where the people who are trying to lead it were downplaying the situation, which is what people tell climate communicators. Don't freak people out, don't talk too much about 1.5 being gone. Other things like this, right? That ain't what Ukraine did when Putin was invading. It is certainly not what Winston Churchill did when Hitler started crossing the Ardennes, or beforehand, which is why we look at him as something of a leader of merit. It isn't what any successful wartime mobilization did, or really any successful union mobilization ever did. If anything, people actually exaggerated the threat. It's never been done by underplaying the threat, which shows that essentially there's something very wrong here. That's what the 4 dimensions are meant as an answer to. Well, we have 3 campaigns which are in the workplace, in communities, and in schools. And most people either live in a community, work somewhere, or go to school. If none of those 3 campaigns are really calling people, I can talk a little bit at the end about the process of finding your own work to do, which we can also help with. We have quite a lot of connections to people who've been helping, at this point, hundreds of people go through the process of figuring out how to use their own particular connections, talents, and passions to play a role in the climate response. To explain what the campaigns are, we can start with the first one, which is the community-facing one, right? So most people live somewhere, and in communities across the UK, either now or in the very near future, there are concrete, real consequences of climate change which need to be prepared for. It's really obvious in places along the coastline, but when you start going into it, you find out that we're closer than one might think to serious problems with the water system, with the food system, food security, in an increasingly unstable world that is going to soon be beset by climate change in a way that could threaten to knock out several breadbaskets at the same time. A lot of communities could face food shortages potentially, right? And right now we have things like rising flood lines, we have flooding problems, we have, if rainfall patterns changed, which could potentially happen to a great deal. There are fires in places that never were fires before. If you change rainfall patterns in a place that is used to getting a lot of rain, what you get is a lot of very dry vegetation. All these things are real consequences of climate change, right? And that's part of the reason why a huge coalition of UK fire chiefs recently sent out a letter, signed a letter and made a public event out of promoting it, saying that essentially the UK needs a nationwide adaptation plan. And there are communities across the United Kingdom. Our campaign is about getting those communities and professions who are calling for an adaptation plan and who are already doing adaptation together in a coalition, together exchanging information and expertise between them, and together forcing the government to implement a national adaptation plan. And so that campaign as a whole is called SAFER, which means Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience. So adaptation is what we do when there are already effects of climate change. And the reason why that campaign is so exciting is that we recently passed the 1.5 degree C barrier. So some people might know what that means. Essentially, we've gone over 1.5 degree Celsius increases in temperatures that scientists told us not to, that we've been warned is kind of a tipping point for an altogether different type of weather. So what that means is if you found the weather a bit freakish in recent decades, you haven't seen anything yet that was still in the normal zone that we weren't supposed to get out of, and we are now officially out of it, which means that adaptation to effects which are already here is necessary. And it's important in that as we enter that era for people who care about environmental progress as a whole to be involved in adaptation to help define the issue, right? The issue can't be we're going to adapt our way out of the consequences or out of the situation that we've gotten ourselves into. We can't just continue to keep on emitting because more emissions are going to mean things like the breakdown of the Atlantic currents that warm Britain. There's not really a way of fully adapting to that, right? So what we need is a adaptation campaign or a national adaptation push that is totally aware of that and sees adaptation as a step towards an overall strategic response that achieves resilience as a nation and as a world, right? So why is it that perhaps actually by saving their own arses, people across Britain might be doing the best thing they could do for the world's good? Well, because there's no message that a relatively small country that like Britain could send that's going to be more affecting than the world seeing on BBC World Britain's battening down the hatches in unison and having this national adaptation conversation. If suddenly this is really high profile, money is getting spent on it, there's very active, visible things done about it, and that spreads across to Europe, it'll spread quite a lot of other places. And if it spreads across the world, an adaptation concern, it also brings with it a lot of people going down the rabbit hole and seeing exactly what we're up against. So, and also the other thing is that we always have been asking since the beginning of climate action, gee, don't we need the whole world on side to get anywhere? And that kind of immobilizes a lot of people, right? Well, an adaptation, you can make the next few decades of your own life much better by your own personal action, by your own community action, by your own national action. So in terms of building momentum in climate action, it's a total game changer. That's the way we approach it. A national adaptation plan would involve every community across the UK having its own adaptation plan, and those communities helping each other, and particularly if it's a national adaptation plan, the government providing coordinated support for every community to do its own adaptation plan. So we don't need to wait for the government, however. The campaign isn't about that. It's about helping those communities that are already taking the lead and doing adaptation to find each other, to help, to learn from each other, and to make their own efforts more visible. Right, so right now adaptation is not super visible. There's a lot of communities across the UK that are already doing it though. We're already thinking about how are we going to deal with rising floodwaters. We're already thinking about pollution of their own water systems. We're already thinking about how to deal with potential food shortages. And we have a lot of those together into a network already. And together those are going to be the most effective groups to make adaptation more visible and to tell the government it needs to act, because they've been thinking about it and they are the climate majority. It's not the usual suspects, right? That's another great thing about that campaign, is that if you want to see an issue that appeals outside what we call the progressive bubble, the typical climate bubble, community level adaptation is it. It's a group of people that isn't the usual suspects. That will probably break the mold as they call for a national adaptation plan. It becomes, what's important to notice about these community adaptation efforts, right, is that there's nothing that makes climate change more real than seeing things get done and seeing people like you, especially your neighbors, doing something about it. So if your friends and families and neighbors are actually doing adaptation, then immediately it takes on a different level of actual reality than most people have experienced so far. That brings us to our second campaign, which is called the Climate Courage Campaign, which is in another area where there's a lot of people, which is schools. So as we just mentioned before, having a community around you that makes you feel like you're part of something larger helps people to take climate action, right? That environment can exist anywhere, but one of the places it's most necessary is in schools. The Department of Education states as its own priority the necessity to help students prepare for their future, to give them the knowledge and skills necessary to prepare for the careers of the future, to make life decisions. They simply can't do that without engaging in climate education, which is not right now not on the school curriculum. So not just some scientific facts about climate, but also facts about adaptation and the skills of adaptation, but what exactly we can do to prepare for our own future should be on the curriculum, right? That's totally clear from the basics of what we have acknowledged as our own responsibilities towards our children in the UK and across the world. So the Climate Courage Campaign is about creating that environment in schools. So you can imagine yourself as a teacher who's going to teach climate science. Now, if you're a person who's learned quite a bit about climate science or climate action, and you think about communicating everything that you know to a group of 16-year-olds. We can imagine ourselves, a group of 16-year-olds. I'm going to go and tell them everything I know about climate change and what its consequences are, what might happen to the weather, what might happen to the food system, what that might result in terms of conflict, and all the reasons why I've been losing sleep, and put on a brave face while doing it. If you imagine yourself in those shoes, I think, like me and like a lot of other people, you start to get a sinking feeling in your stomach. Of course, we've spoken to people who've done this before. The campaign was really started after conversations with a few people, one of whom I can talk about, Shamkar Gag, who is a professor just down the street at UCL. So we're very close to UCL as we film this. Cham is a professor of physics at UCL. He's one of the world's leading dark matter physicists. He's the head of was the head last year of the largest dark matter experiment in the world. And he took up teaching climate change and would have students learning as scientists about the enterprise of climate science, the conclusions of climate science, and having quizzes where they worked out the answers, what a certain amount of emissions meant, sort of going over 2 degrees or going over 2.5 degrees, and what that meant in terms of the Earth's environment and the future. And he realized that they were all thinking, wait, this means I don't know if I have a future. What does this actually mean? And he could feel it in the room as it was happening, right? So what he did is he started to put together his students in groups and say, don't learn just as scientists, but as humans, and talk about this, and then think about what you're going to do about it. And the reports for that type of climate education is that you get a lot more students getting very serious about what they're going to do, and even changing careers, becoming climate ambassadors. So his class was full of people who, like him, were thinking about engaging with some of the greatest and most interesting problems of physics, but a lot of people decided that actually climate tech and climate science were more interesting because essentially we've got a mobilization to make happen. People who agree that there should be more climate education include teachers themselves. They list it as a second priority after greater reading skills. Students, there's a huge number of student groups that are lobbying for it. So Teach the Future is one of the campaign partners. There's also another group called the Ministry of Eco-Education, which is teacher created. That's another partner. So we've got teachers and students calling for it. We also have basically every major scientific organization. So this isn't just climate scientists. So every scientific field thinks that what it is discovering should be our priority to learn. But we're talking about the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is all scientists putting climate education as a top priority. The same is true of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which includes climate change as one of the major reasons why we're close to disaster as a species. So there's essentially total consensus among the entire scientific community that if we're educating students about anything scientifically that's new and relevant to their lives, it should be climate change. So getting that on the curriculum, but also making sure that when people learn about climate change, they feel like they're part of a wider effort that can make a difference. And most crucially, in this case probably, have the emotional support that allows them to really internalize that knowledge, and also that the teacher staff have that support. Because there's this saying that a guy in the US, Van Jones, likes to say, somebody needs to hold the people that hold the people. If we're going to ask teachers to tell students about climate change, then they themselves need someone to talk to, because that's an enormous responsibility. So what we want in that campaign is for those schools that are leaders in the area to be recognized, for the government to recognize that climate distress is a serious issue, that the mental health of students needs safeguarding, and that they need to learn about those crucial facts about their future and the adaptation skills, and have ways of acting as part of a community while they learn. So, and in that we've got the campaign partners that I mentioned earlier, plus leading schools across the country, teachers who've been taking action on their own initiative, and the Climate Psychology Alliance and several other groups of mental health professionals, as well as a wide set of environmentally concerned organizations. The final campaign is called Regulate Us Better, and it's a campaign that's aimed at and involving the business world. So, as I said at the beginning, most people have a job. Anybody in their job can ask their employer to be more serious about lobbying for the type of business environment that is actually needed in order to operate responsibly and sustainably as a business. So there's lots of talk about kind of like business involvement in climate change or climate action. However, businesses have not been as forward as they might be about precisely what is needed, and have not been putting their backs completely into a call to change the business environment in such a way that it is possible to do business sustainably, or that even we're forced to do business sustainably. So what that campaign is about is in many ways getting the people, the willing few in the business world, to say what needs to be said, so that all the rest of the business community doesn't need to say it. To be brutally honest, we're still talking about growth, we're still talking about deregulation and efficiency as we cross the 1.5 degree C barrier, and as everybody at the same time also says that we need to really crack this sustainability issue, right? Like, we need new regulations. 80% of people, if you have polls, 80% of business people and business leaders even say we need new regulations, but there is not a transition lobby, if you will, or a lobby for the future, right? Or for our future. That is calling for, with total honesty, exactly the types of stringent and rigorously enforced regulation that is necessary. And also, we really need businesses on side, because it's a totally legitimate concern that regulation might not be very good if it doesn't have businesses involved. Like, businesses live in fear of ham-handed, ill-executed regulation by the government that does more harm than good. And it's not like a foolish concern. And that's where the better part comes from. Regulate us better. So it's about businesses calling for regulation, but also skillful regulation and helping to make that happen. So if you want to get involved in that, then you should send us an email and talk to the campaign coordinator, Helena Farstad. We don't by any means think that those 3 campaigns are an all-encompassing answer, right? If you think of like a mobilization, what should be happening? If the government were doing its job, it'd be like World War II. You'd go to a great big HR office and someone would hand you something to do and say, well, you're going to make socks, right? Or you're going to be in the paratroopers or whatever, right? There wasn't a single call to action. The call to action was essentially enlist, right? And that was nice and simple, but then the government was doing all the complicated bits that were underneath the hood of routing and directing people to the many, many, many things that a successful wartime mobilization required. A climate mobilization is no less complicated than that, and that's why there's no simple, easy 4-point theory of change that can direct us through it, right? What we need is essentially a popular-led mobilization, and then that requires a lot of people as well finding their own work to do.